Ruthless bikers taunt a young man, his shocking response leaves them stunned. The city streets were dimly lit, the glow of neon signs reflecting off the damp pavement. Outside a popular nightclub, a group of intimidating bikers known as the Iron Jackals loitered, their mere presence enough to make passers-by uneasy. Led by the notorious Ret Viper, Dawson, the gang thrived on dominance, using their numbers and reputation to get their way. That night, as they lingered by their motorcycles, they set their sights on Ethan Calloway, a quiet young man walking past. Dressed in simple clothes with his head slightly bowed, he seemed like an easy target. The bikers laughed at him, their voices echoing in the night air. One of them stepped forward and shoved Ethan, demanding that he show respect to real men like them. Another grabbed his shoulder, expecting to see fear in the young man's eyes. But what they didn't know was that Ethan was no ordinary man. Beneath his unassuming exterior lay a past that few could imagine. A former elite special forces operative and a member of one of the world's most powerful families, Ethan had spent years staying out of the spotlight, content to live a life of solitude. Tonight, however, something was different. As the bikers taunted him, Ethan felt a spark of defiance ignite within him. He had spent too long hiding from his true self, too long allowing others to dictate his path. In that moment, he made a decision, one that would change the course of his life and the lives of those around him. Without raising his voice or making a scene, Ethan calmly stared down the gang leader. The laughter stopped abruptly as the bikers realized that something was amiss. They had picked the wrong target, and now they would face the consequences of their actions. The silence that fell over the street was palpable, broken only by the distant hum of traffic and the occasional flicker of a streetlight. The Iron Jackals, accustomed to being feared and respected, found themselves taken aback by Ethan's unwavering gaze. Ret Viper, Dawson, the gang's leader, narrowed his eyes, trying to size up the young man before him. Ethan remained still, his posture relaxed yet alert. He had faced far worse than a group of unruly bikers in his time serving his country, and he knew that the key to survival lay in maintaining control over one's emotions. As he stood there, a few of the bikers began to notice something strange about his presence, an aura of quiet confidence that seemed to radiate from him. One of the older members of the gang, a grizzled veteran known as Razor, took a step closer to Ethan, peering at him intently. Suddenly, recognition dawned on his face, and he took a stumbling step backward. "Calloway," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know that name." The other bikers turned to look at Razor, confusion etched on their faces. Ret, however, remained focused on Ethan, his hand resting on the hilt of a concealed knife. "I don't care who he is," the gang leader growled. "He's on our turf, and he needs to learn some respect." Ethan's lips curled into a faint smile, but there was no mirth in his eyes. "Respect is earned, not demanded," he said, his voice calm and steady. "And from where I'm standing, I don't see any reason to give it to you." The bikers bristled at his words, their postures shifting as they prepared for a fight. Ethan, however, remained unmoved. He had faced death countless times, and he knew that violence was rarely the answer. Tonight, he would teach these men a lesson they would never forget, one that would challenge everything they thought they knew about power and control. As the tension mounted, Ret Viper, Dawson made his move. With a snarl, he lunged at Ethan, his knife glinting in the dim light. Ethan, however, was ready. In a blur of motion, he sidestepped the attack, his hand shooting out to grab Ret's wrist. With a deft twist, he sent the knife clattering to the ground, disarming the gang leader in a single, fluid motion. The other bikers watched in stunned silence as Ethan effortlessly neutralized their leader. Some of them reached for their own weapons, but a glance from Ethan froze them in their tracks. They had never seen anyone move with such speed and precision, and the realization that they were outmatched began to dawn on them. Razor, the old biker who had recognized Ethan's name, spoke up. "You don't want to do this, Viper," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "The Calloways, they're not to be messed with. I've heard stories." Ret, his pride wounded and his anger boiling over, shook off Razor's warning. "I don't care who he is," he spat. "No one disrespects the Iron Jackals and gets away with it." Ethan shook his head, a hint of sadness in his eyes. "This isn't about respect," he said. "It's about the choices we make and the lives we lead. You think you're strong because you can intimidate others, but true strength comes from within." The bikers shifted uneasily, some of them beginning to question their leader's orders. They had never encountered someone like Ethan before, someone who seemed to possess a depth of knowledge and experience far beyond their own. Rhett, sensing his control over the gang slipping away, made one last desperate attempt to reassert his dominance. He charged at Ethan, his fists raised and a roar of fury tearing from his throat. Ethan, however, was already moving. In a heartbeat, he had the gang leader pinned to the ground, his knee pressed against Rhett's back and his hand on the biker's neck. The Iron Jackals watched in disbelief as Ethan held their leader down, his grip firm but not cruel. Rhett struggled against the hold, his face contorted with rage and humiliation. "Let me go," he growled, his voice muffled by the pavement. "You're dead, Calloway. You hear me? Dead." Ethan leaned in closer, his voice low and steady. "I'm not here to fight you, Rhett," he said. "I'm here to show you a different path. One that doesn't involve preying on the weak and vulnerable." The other bikers exchanged glances, unsure of what to do. Some of them looked ready to flee, their loyalty to their leader shaken by Ethan's display of skill and strength. Others, however, seemed to be considering his words, their expressions thoughtful and uncertain. Razor, the old biker who had recognized Ethan's name, stepped forward. "He's right, Viper," he said, his voice gruff but firm. "We've been going down the wrong road for too long. Maybe it's time we started thinking about something different." Rhett snarled, his eyes blazing with defiance. "You're going soft, Razor," he spat. "The Iron Jackals don't take orders from anyone, especially not some rich kid playing hero." Ethan shook his head, a flicker of disappointment crossing his face. "This isn't about being a hero," he said. "It's about doing what's right. And deep down, I think you know that what you're doing is wrong." For a long moment, the street was silent, the only sound the distant wail of a siren. Then, slowly, Ethan released his hold on Rhett and stepped back, his hands held out in a gesture of peace. "You have a choice," he said, his gaze sweeping over the assembled bikers. "You can continue down this path, hurting others and destroying yourselves in the process. Or you can choose to be better, to be the kind of men you know you can be." As he spoke, a glimmer of hope began to take root in the hearts of some of the bikers. They had never been given a chance like this before, a chance to change, to be something more than just another gang on the streets. And as they looked at Ethan, standing tall and proud in the face of their aggression, they began to believe that maybe, just maybe, he was right. In the days that followed, word of Ethan's encounter with the Iron Jackals spread like wildfire through the city's underworld. Some dismissed it as a fairy tale, a story too good to be true. Others, however, saw it as a sign of change, a glimmer of hope in a world that had long been dominated by violence and fear. For Ethan, the confrontation had been a turning point. He had spent years running from his past, trying to escape the weight of his family's legacy and the expectations that came with it. But now, he realized that he could no longer hide from who he was, or from the responsibility that came with his abilities. As he walked the streets of the city, Ethan began to see things in a new light. He noticed the small acts of kindness that often went overlooked, the stranger who helped an elderly woman with her groceries, the teenager who stood up to a bully on the playground. And he realized that these moments, however fleeting, were what truly mattered. Meanwhile, the Iron Jackals were in disarray. Rhett, humiliated by his defeat at Ethan's hands, had become even more unpredictable and violent, lashing out at anyone who dared to question his authority. Some of the bikers, led by Razor, had begun to distance themselves from the gang, seeking a new path that didn't involve hurting others. As tensions within the gang escalated, Ethan knew that he couldn't stand by and watch. He had seen firsthand the damage that groups like the Iron Jackals could inflict on a community, and he was determined to do something about it. Reaching out to his contacts in the city's social services and community organizations, Ethan began to formulate a plan. He knew that many of the bikers had turned to the gang out of desperation, a lack of opportunities, a sense of hopelessness, and a need for belonging. If he could show them a different way, a path that led to something better, perhaps he could help them break free from the cycle of violence and crime. As Ethan set his plan into motion, he found himself facing unexpected challenges. Many of the bikers were deeply entrenched in their ways, resistant to the idea of change. Some were openly hostile, seeing Ethan's efforts as a threat to their way of life. But Ethan refused to give up. He had seen the flicker of hope in the eyes of some of the bikers, and he was determined to fan that flame into something brighter and more enduring. With the help of his allies in the community, he began to organize meetings and events, inviting the bikers to come and hear about the opportunities that were available to them. At first, attendance was sparse. Many of the bikers were wary of Ethan and his intentions, and some even accused him of trying to trick them. But gradually, as word of the meeting spread and more bikers began to show up, the atmosphere began to change. Razor, who had become an unlikely ally in Ethan's efforts, spoke passionately about the need for change. He had seen too many of his friends and fellow bikers fall victim to violence and addiction, and he knew that there had to be a better way. As the meetings grew in size and intensity, Ethan began to see glimmers of transformation. Some of the bikers, who had once been filled with anger and resentment, began to open up about their struggles and their hopes for the future. They talked about wanting to find steady work, to rebuild relationships with their families, and to make a positive difference in their communities. But even as progress was being made, tensions within the Iron Jackals continued to simmer. Rhett, who saw Ethan's efforts as a direct threat to his power, grew increasingly erratic and violent. He lashed out at anyone who showed even the slightest hint of disloyalty, and his behavior began to alienate even his most stalwart supporters. Ethan knew that a confrontation was inevitable. But he also knew that he had to be smart about how he approached it. With the help of his newfound allies, he began to lay the groundwork for a final showdown, one that would determine the fate of not just the Iron Jackals, but of the entire community. As the day of the confrontation drew near, Ethan found himself grappling with a mix of emotions. On one hand, he was filled with a sense of purpose and determination, knowing that he was fighting for something truly important. On the other hand, he was all too aware of the risks involved, the danger that he and his allies would be putting themselves in. But even in the face of his own doubts and fears, Ethan remained resolute. He had seen the power of hope and compassion, and he knew that those were the weapons he would need to wield in the battle ahead. As he made his final preparations, Ethan reached out to the bikers who had shown the most promise, the ones who had begun to see a different path for themselves. He invited them to stand with him, to be a part of something bigger than themselves. To his surprise, many of them agreed. They had seen the changes that Ethan had helped to bring about, and they wanted to be a part of that legacy. Even Razor, who had once been one of Rhett's most loyal followers, pledged his support to Ethan's cause. On the day of the confrontation, Ethan and his allies gathered outside the nightclub where the Iron Jackals held court. They were met by a wall of bikers, their faces twisted with anger and defiance. At their head was Rhett, his eyes blazing with a mad fury. For a moment, the two sides stood in silence, sizing each other up. Then, with a roar of engines, the bikers surged forward, ready to crush Ethan and his allies beneath their wheels. But Ethan was ready. With a calm precision that belied the chaos around him, he stepped forward, his hands held out in a gesture of peace. "Stop," he said, his voice ringing out clear and strong. "This doesn't have to end in violence." For a moment, the bikers hesitated, taken aback by Ethan's words. And in that moment, something extraordinary happened. From the ranks of the bikers, a figure stepped forward, Razor, his face set with determination. "He's right," the old biker said, his voice gruff but firm. "This has to end. Now." Rhett's eyes widened in disbelief as he watched Razor step forward, his jaw clenching with barely controlled rage. "You traitor," he spat, his hand reaching for the knife at his belt. "You dare turn against me?" But Razor stood his ground, his gaze unwavering. "This isn't about loyalty, Viper," he said, using Rhett's old nickname. "This is about doing what's right. And what we've been doing, it ain't right." Around him, other bikers began to murmur their agreement. Some stepped forward to stand beside Razor, their faces set with determination. Others hung back, uncertain but clearly swayed by the old biker's words. Ethan watched the scene unfold with a sense of awe and gratitude. He had hoped that his efforts would make a difference, but he had never imagined that they would lead to a moment like this, a moment when the very people he had once fought against would stand beside him in solidarity. Rhett, however, was not so easily swayed. With a snarl of fury, he lunged at Razor, his knife flashing in the dim light. But before he could strike, Ethan was there, his hand closing around Rhett's wrist in an iron grip. For a moment, the two men stood locked in a battle of wills, their eyes locked on each other. Then, slowly, Ethan began to speak. "It's over, Rhett," he said, his voice calm but firm. "You can't win this fight. Not anymore." Around them, the other bikers watched in silence, their eyes wide with anticipation. Some still looked uncertain, torn between their loyalty to Rhett and their growing sense that something had to change. But as Ethan spoke, his words began to sink in. He talked about the power of second chances, about the possibility of redemption and forgiveness. He spoke of the ways in which they could all work together to build something better, a community that was built on trust and compassion rather than fear and violence. And slowly, one by one, the bikers began to nod their heads. They had heard Ethan's words, and they knew in their hearts that he was right. It was time for a change that would start with them. In the weeks that followed, Ethan and his allies worked tirelessly to build on the momentum they had gained. They reached out to local businesses and community organizations, forging partnerships and creating programs that would help the bikers find new paths forward. Some of the bikers, like Razor, threw themselves into the work with a passion and dedication that surprised even themselves. They helped to organize job fairs and training programs, working alongside Ethan to create opportunities for their fellow bikers. Others struggled with the transition, grappling with years of anger and resentment that were not so easily let go. But even they could not deny the changes that were taking place, the sense of purpose and hope that was beginning to take root in their community. As for Rhett, he found himself increasingly isolated and alone. Many of his former followers had turned their backs on him, disgusted by his cruelty and his refusal to change. Some even spoke out against him publicly, denouncing his actions and calling for him to be held accountable. But even in his darkest moments, Ethan refused to give up on Rhett. He knew that the road to redemption was long and difficult, and that some might never find their way. But he also believed in the power of forgiveness, the idea that everyone deserved a chance to make things right. And so he continued to reach out to Rhett, offering him the same opportunities that he had given to the other bikers. At first, Rhett resisted, his pride and his anger holding him back. But gradually, as he saw the changes taking place around him, he began to waver. It was a small moment, a fleeting instant of vulnerability that might have gone unnoticed by anyone else. But Ethan saw it, and he knew that it was a sign of hope. A sign that even the most hardened heart could be touched by the power of compassion and grace. And so he pressed on, his resolve stronger than ever. He knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, but he also knew that he was not alone. With the help of his allies and the support of his community, he would continue to fight for what was right, no matter how hard the battle might be. As the months passed, the changes in the community became more and more apparent. The streets that had once been filled with fear and violence now buzzed with a new energy, a sense of purpose and possibility that was infectious. The bikers who had once been lost and angry now found themselves at the center of a growing movement, a grassroots effort to build something better and more enduring. They worked side by side with community leaders and activists, learning new skills and forging new connections. Some of them even began to take on leadership roles themselves, using their unique experiences and perspectives to help guide the way forward. They spoke out at town hall meetings and rallies, their voices strong and clear as they called for change. And through it all, Ethan remained a constant presence, a guiding light that helped to keep them on the right path. He worked tirelessly to support their efforts, using his resources and his influence to help them overcome the many obstacles that stood in their way. But even as the community celebrated its successes, Ethan knew that the work was far from over. There were still challenges to be faced, old wounds that needed to be healed, and new threats that loomed on the horizon. One of the greatest of these threats came from within the community itself, from those who resisted the changes that were taking place, and who clung to the old ways of violence and fear. Some of them even began to organize against Ethan and his allies, spreading rumors and sowing discord wherever they could. But Ethan refused to be deterred. He knew that the only way to truly defeat the forces of darkness was to confront them head-on, to shine a light on their lies and their hatred, and to expose them for what they really were. And so he pressed on, his resolve stronger than ever. He knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, but he also knew that he was not alone. With the help of his allies and the support of his community, he would continue to fight for what was right, no matter how hard the battle might be. As the conflict with the resistors intensified, Ethan found himself grappling with a growing sense of unease. He had always believed in the power of redemption, the idea that anyone could change if given the chance. But now, faced with the intractable hatred of some in his community, he began to wonder if that belief had been naive. He spent long hours in contemplation, seeking guidance from the people he trusted most. And slowly, through those conversations and reflections, he began to see a new way forward, a path that was grounded not in blind optimism, but in a deep and abiding faith in the human spirit. He knew that he could not force change on those who were not ready for it, that true transformation had to come from within. But he also knew that he could create the conditions for that change to take root, that by modeling compassion and understanding, he could help to break down the walls that divided his community. And so he began to shift his approach, focusing less on confrontation and more on building bridges. He reached out to the resistors, not with anger or judgment, but with an open heart and a willingness to listen. At first, his efforts were met with suspicion and hostility. But gradually, as he continued to show up and to engage in good faith, some of the resistors began to soften their stance. They saw in Ethan a sincerity and a depth of commitment that they could not deny, and they began to wonder if perhaps there was another way. It was a slow and painful process, marked by setbacks and moments of despair. But through it all, Ethan remained steadfast in his belief that change was possible, that even the most hardened hearts could be touched by the power of love and grace. And as he watched his community begin to heal, he knew that his faith had not been misplaced. They had confronted the darkness within themselves, and they had emerged stronger and more united than ever before. The road ahead would not be easy, but they would walk it together, step by step, hand in hand, toward a brighter and more hopeful future. As the community continued to heal and grow, Ethan found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this point. He thought back to the moment when he had first confronted the Iron Jackals, the moment when he had made the choice to stand up for what was right, no matter the cost. He remembered the fear and uncertainty that had gripped him in those early days, the sense that he was up against an impossible task. But he also remembered the moments of grace and beauty that had sustained him along the way, the small acts of kindness and courage that had given him hope even in the darkest of times. And as he looked out over his community now, at the faces of the people he had come to know and love, he knew that those moments had been worth it. They had faced their demons and emerged stronger, more compassionate, and more connected than ever before. But even as they celebrated their progress, Ethan knew that the work was not yet done. There were still challenges to be faced, still wounds to be healed and bridges to be built. And he knew that it would take all of them, working together, to create the kind of lasting change that they all longed for. And so he continued to lead by example, modeling the values of compassion, understanding, and forgiveness that had brought them this far. He worked to create spaces for dialogue and connection, bringing together people from all walks of life to share their stories and their hopes for the future. And slowly, day by day, those efforts began to bear fruit. The community began to thrive in ways that they had never thought possible, not just in terms of material prosperity, but in terms of the deeper bonds of trust and belonging that held them together. As Ethan looked out over the sea of faces before him, he felt a sense of profound gratitude wash over him. They had come so far, and they had done it together, not through force or coercion, but through the power of love and compassion. And he knew that, whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them as one, united in their commitment to building a better world for all. As the years passed, the community that Ethan and his allies had helped to build continued to flourish. The seeds of hope and transformation that they had planted took root and spread, touching lives far beyond the borders of their city. The bikers who had once been lost and angry found new purpose and meaning in their lives. They became leaders and mentors, passing on the lessons they had learned to a new generation of young people who were hungry for change. And Ethan himself became a symbol of that change, a living embodiment of the power of redemption and second chances. He continued to work tirelessly on behalf of his community, using his platform to advocate for justice and equality at every turn. But even as he celebrated the progress they had made, Ethan never lost sight of the challenges that still lay ahead. He knew that the work of building a more just and compassionate world was never truly finished, that there would always be new obstacles to overcome and new bridges to build. And so he continued to push forward, even in the face of setbacks and disappointments. He drew strength from the people around him, from the love and support of his family and friends, and from the unwavering commitment of his allies in the struggle for change. And through it all, he held fast to the belief that had guided him from the very beginning, the belief that every person, no matter their past or their circumstances, deserved a chance at redemption and a better life. It was a belief that had been tested time and again, a belief that had brought him to the very brink of despair. But it was also a belief that had sustained him through the darkest of times, and that had ultimately led him to the place of hope and possibility where he now stood. And as he looked out over the community that he had helped to build, he knew that that belief would continue to guide them all in the years to come, a shining beacon of light in a world that so often seemed shrouded in darkness. In the end, the story of Ethan and the Iron Jackals became a legend, a tale of hope and redemption that inspired people far beyond the borders of their community. It was a story that spoke to the power of the human spirit to overcome even the darkest of circumstances, and to find light in the midst of despair. For Ethan himself, it was a story that he carried with him always, a reminder of the incredible journey that he had taken, and of the people who had walked beside him every step of the way. He knew that he could not have done it alone, that it had taken the love and support of countless others to bring him to the place where he now stood. And so he made it his mission to pay that love forward, to use his platform and his influence to lift up others who were struggling, and to help them find their own paths to redemption and hope. He worked tirelessly to create opportunities for those who had been left behind, and to build a world in which every person had the chance to thrive. And through it all, he remained grounded in the values that had brought him this far, the values of compassion, forgiveness, and unwavering faith in the goodness of the human heart. He knew that those values would continue to guide him in the years to come, as he worked to build a brighter future for all. As he looked back on the journey that had brought him to this moment, Ethan felt a sense of profound gratitude wash over him. He was grateful for the challenges that had tested him, and for the moments of grace and beauty that had sustained him along the way. But most of all, he was grateful for the people who had walked beside him, the allies and friends who had helped him to find his way, and who had shown him the true meaning of love and compassion. They had been his guiding light in the darkness, and he knew that he would carry their love with him always, as he continued on the path that lay ahead.